Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Terrestrial Material, where we talk about the material us terrestrials are interested in. Tonight, we're joined by Philip Mantle. He's a leading expert on the Pascagoula abduction that took place on October 11, 1973, to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Tonight, we talk about not only the encounter, but his latest book entitled Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. Philip is an international UFO researcher, lecturer, and broadcaster. He is the former Director of Investigations for the British UFO Research Association and former MUFON representative for England. Let's not make him wait any longer. Happy Sunday, Philip. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming on Terrestrial Material. How you doing?
No, it's my pleasure, Matthew. Nice to speak to you.
Yeah, the Pascagoula abduction case has been probably the case that's meant the most to me. I have never really dived into a lot of the abduction cases over the years. I've been into ufology for a really, really long time, but this is the one that kind of stood out to me the most. Obviously, the recordings that were hidden from the police, or that the police hid, was incredible evidence for the case. And I think that's what really drew me in. But your books, I actually had a viewer on my channel weekly offer this book up, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Pascagoula Alien Abduction, that you wrote that along with, and if I get this right, Irina McCammon, Scott? Is it McCammon?
I have Dr. Scott, yeah.
Yeah, tremendous. And I just really, his name was Rotary Motion. I'll give him a little bit of shout out because he's a big reason why you're here today. But I went through the book and it was really incredible. And I learned so much about the case that I had never known before. I hadn't able to take like that much of a deep dive into it. But what about the case first came to you? I mean, what really stood out to you and really brought your whole research into this process?
Well, it started back in the 1980s. You know, I started to become involved in UFO research, and I read about the case in a magazine. And it was the creatures that were seen that night that really, stuck in the back of my mind. Because they were so different to anything else. For those that are not aware, they were humanoid. They had no neck. They had pointed protrusions out of the side of the head and the front. They had long arms. They had pincer-like appendages. And they were grey in colour. And Charlie and Calvin said their skin, if that's what it was, reminded them of like an elephant, grey and wrinkly. And that stood out to me. So I moved on down the years. And come the early 90s, by this time I was also a conference organizer here in the UK. And I tried to get Charles Hickson to come and speak at one of the conferences. And for whatever reason, it never happened. So that's where I got interested. Then we jump forward in time. In 2015, I started my own publishing venture, what I call Flying Disc Press. And one of my aims, if you like, was to try and get my hands on some old books and republish them. And of course, Charlie Hickson co-authored a book with William Mendes in 1983, and it's called UFO Contact at Pascagoula. And it didn't hardly sell anything. So you could pick up an odd copy here and there, but it cost an absolute arm and a leg.
Yeah.
So I bought one, and then I set out to find out who held the rights to it, which I did. And we came to an agreement that I could republish it. But I had to rewrite it. That's why there's so many spelling mistakes in it. That's my fault.
I see.
I didn't have any document. I just had the book in front of me.
Yeah.
And while I'm doing this, I knew Charlie Hickson had passed away in 2011, but I wasn't sure about the other guy involved, Calvin Parker.
Right.
So I did a search. I couldn't find any obituary for him. I found out he resurfaced in 2013 for a short while and then disappeared again. So I thought I'll try and find him, and if I can, I'll just get an interview with him and put it at the back of this book, just to bring it up to date, So it took me about 3 months, and at this time, Matthew, the case was dead and buried. I contacted some people in Mississippi; they'd never even heard of it.
Wow!
But I eventually got an email, and I got his phone number, and I managed to get him on the phone. And he was very polite and very nice, but clearly didn't want to talk to me, So I left him to think about it, and I called him back. What I didn't know is that not that long before I contacted Calvin, he'd been with his wife to a funeral. One of his friends
Oh,
had passed
wow.
away,
Yeah.
and they're coming out of the funeral home, and he signed a book of condolence, and he signed it, Calvin Parker. Of
Yeah.
course, all the people behind him going, they saw his name. Oh, it's the alien man, And at first he found that disrespectful.
I bet.
But his wife, Waynette, says, well, I'm fed up with this. Why the hell don't you write your story down and tell everybody? Then everybody will know. And he said, yes, darling, but he had no intention of it, Matthew.
Right.
And I think it was our second or third phone call. He said, Philip, I'm going to write my own book. He said, I've started. I said, well, okay. But I said, why won't you give me an interview? He said, well, whenever I give people an interview, they always write it wrong. It comes out wrong, I said, well, the only way to avoid that is you write it yourself. And I said, if you're going to write the book, I'll help you.
Yeah.
I said, I'll tell you what, I'll send you a sample contract, which I did. I never thought, Matthew, that he'd ever sign it. And he said, I'll do it with you, Philip, on one condition, and that is you don't change anything.
It's the chances that we don't take that we regret, right? So it's great that you did that.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I said, fine. He says, even the spelling mistakes, you're going to leave them. So we did it. The book came out. It became an Amazon bestseller, much to our surprise. Calvin went and did local, national, and then international television. He lectured at a few UFO conferences, and it was almost, Matthew, as if his weight had lifted off him, as if to say, why the hell didn't I do that sooner?
I'd imagine. Yeah, I'd imagine if you've ever held something on your chest for a long time and you get to release that, it really is cathartic, without a doubt.
And that's how it all started, and we thought we'll publish the book. None of us knew what was going to happen. Calvin was treated with respect, whereas back in 1973, when the incident happened, a lot of people were prepared to poke fun at him, and he wanted nothing to do with it. So we were up and running, and that's how it all began. And, the book came out in 2018.
Why do you feel, because I think I remember from the book you talking about where you felt a stronger connection with Calvin than you ever did Charles?
Well, I never met Charlie, never had a chance to speak to him. He died in 2011.
Wow, I figured you would have. I figured you would have had a chance.
No, like I said, we tried to get him to come to the UK in the early 1990s to speak at a conference.
Oh, no, yeah, but I figured you might have took another shot,
No, because, the invitation was done by a colleague of mine. He knew him. So I said, well, you if you know him, you ask him,
Oh, I get it, yeah.
And I never really got a reason why he couldn't come. He initially said yes, and then something went wrong. So I forgot about it. I just left it there. I was busy. Our conferences were absolutely enormous. They got bigger every year.
Incredible, yeah.
I got a wife, 2 kids. I wrote my first book in 1994. So I was a busy guy. So, that got left behind. It's only when my circumstances changed, then I thought about, the Pascagoula case, especially when I saw the cost of one of Charlie's secondhand books. If you could get one for $100, you were doing well.
There's a lot of books that are that way. I've got a buddy that comes on, Nick from the Cosmic Twilight. He collects a lot of the old Nazi kind of UFO books, and he spent tons and tons of money to try to get a hold of those books, and they're hard to come by nowadays. I mean, the books are, obviously the content's incredible, but you know what I really liked about your book, your recent one here, is the cover art. I mean, I really like graphic design a lot, and the book cover and the book itself, it stands out. Would you have a hand in that, or who designed it?
What it is, once we started to do the books, the first one was Charlie Hickson's reprint. And a gentleman who I got in contact with online is called Mark Randall. He is an artist. He was just starting out. He got his own way of doing things, his own look.
Yeah.
And I asked him if he wanted to do the cover of Charlie's book first off. So he said, yeah. And then as the other books came out, he did every cover for us. So it's been Mark all the way through. So Mark knows the story. He knows the people. he has, I mean, he's a tremendous artist in his own right, don't get me wrong, but he has the feel for that case. He really does. And you're not the only one to comment on the cover art, I can assure you.
Well, I find it interesting he went with purple. There's a lot of purple. You know, when we talk about the craft a little bit later on, it's blue lights. Everyone's reporting blue lights. Why do you think he went with purple over blue?
Well, it was just his way of looking at things, you know, and it seemed to hit the spot. I mean, anything and everything we did when it came to Calvin was always run by Calvin first. We never did anything without him giving us the green light. And he loved it as well. So, you know, that made it even better. Of course, Calvin, you know, wrote the foreword for our latest book. And it was just a follow. It's almost, the case itself has evolved since we first got in touch.
So much, incredibly, yeah.
And the cover art has pretty much done the same as well. So it's kind of gone with the story, if you see what I mean.
And that's one thing that I think attracted me so much to the book as I got through it and got towards the middle, is that I really like to look back and take, you know, the current theories in ufology and see what we can look back on it and discover about previous cases. And this case is one of the greatest examples of being able to do that so far, in my opinion.
Well, absolutely. And what Dr. Scott and I decided to do right from when we started investigating the case, you know, I was ringing people up, getting the time wrong, you know, and trying to interview them. So I needed somebody who would assist me. Now, I published a number of Irina's books, and I asked if she'd like to come on board and help. And she says, yeah, great. So, you know, we'd either find people or they'd find us. I'd make the initial contact one way or another and pass it on to Irina. And she did the majority of the interviews. And it just went on and on and on and on and got more and more people. And these are not people wanting 15 minutes of fame.
Correct.
You know, some of them just made a minor comment somewhere and I saw it and I jumped on them. You know, others we found, you know, by, you know, a bit of detective work.
What was your expectation going into that? I mean, when you started going through and combing through all these witnesses, Philip, did you find that they were meeting your expectations? Did you have to weed out a couple of bad apples, or what?
We didn't really have any, Matthew. I mean, we went back to the beginning, because back in 1973, there were a couple of people who stepped forward and said, I saw that thing that night.
Right.
Then, some years later, a former U.S. naval officer stepped forward and said he'd seen it. He'd been on leave with a couple of his friends driving through the area. Once Calvin's book came out, this is how it all began. I was contacted by a chap in Greece, believe it or not.
Wow.
His name is Stephanos Panagiotakis. You have no idea how long I had to practice to pronounce his name correctly, you know?
I believe it.
Now, in 1981, Stephanos was two things. One, he was a UFO researcher. Two, he was in the Greek Merchant Navy. And they docked in Pascagoula. And he thought, great, that was his favorite case. So he set off to try and get an interview with Charles Hickson, which he did. And he went to the local police station and introduced himself and explained what he was doing. And they said, you need to speak to Pastor Sigalis. He saw the thing that night. So they gave him his address. So Stephanos went and knocked on his door, and he was of Greek origin. So here you've got a Greek guy standing in your doorstep. And he got an interview with him. What happened on that night, October the 11th, 1973, Pastor Sigalis and a chap called Don Broadus, who was from the probation office, and a young church volunteer, a young lady in the back of the car, set off to go to a meeting that was church-sponsored for people who had alcohol problems.
Right.
They're en route, and lo and behold, the UFO passed right over the road in front of them. It was witnessed by all three of them. The young lady saw it first because she was looking out the passenger window. Mr. Broadus had just passed away a couple of months before. So Stephanos got the full interview with Pastor Sigalis, and he still had it. He wrote it up.
Yeah.
So that was great. So we got another witness. But hang on a minute. What about this young lady in the back seat?
Yeah, sure.
So we did some digging. We found her name. She was called Joanne Hallmark. She wasn't a native of Pascagoula. She was only there, I think, for a year or 2 years. She taught at the local school, volunteered at the church, and then was gone. We managed to find an old black and white photograph of her from, I think, 1974. So the search was on for her.
Yeah.
So I found a couple of social media accounts that were dead, Matthew. They're long since gone.
I believe it, yeah.
So I left it, and then at some point I went back, a long while after, and I looked at these social media accounts again, and on one of them, it mentioned a particular church. And I just Googled it. And hey, presto, there was this church. And it had its own website.
Wow.
So I linked on it. When you look down on this website, there were some sermons you could listen to. And it was two men, both called Hallmark. And I thought, hellfire. Is this her husband? Or is it possibly her sons?
Yeah.
So the church had a generic email address, info@church of whatever.
Sure.
So I emailed them. I said, I'm looking for this lady. She was in Pascagoula working with Pastor Sigalas in 1973. If she's still around, could you pass the email on, please? I didn't mention anything about UFOs. About 3 or 4 weeks later, Mrs. Hallmark replied, confirmed who she was, and she'd worked with Pastor Sigalas. So then I said, look, this is what I'm researching. This is what I'm involved in. She came back and told us everything. We got a phone number. Dr. Scott contacted her. She now lived in Maryland, whatever the hell that is, somewhere in America,
Yeah, it's on the East Coast. Yeah, it's a little ways away, but yeah.
Yeah. So she got a full interview with her, and she even sent us a photograph of herself as she looks today. She was rather amused at the old 1974 photo I sent her.
Yeah.
And so this lady didn't step out of the shadows. We did a bit of detective work and were able to find her and interview her, and she's in the book,
Yep.
So, and that's how we went, and things just grew and grew. More people would come forward, or we'd see people and we'd find them. And that's just one example. And it got to the point, what Irina and I were doing, we'd write an article. We found this. We'd write we got to about 10 articles. And I'm thinking, maybe we should put all this in a book.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's how the recent book came about. And what we decided to do is put everything that we got in the book, and we'd allow the readers to be the judge and jury, so to speak.
I'm such a fan of that, Philip. That's probably my favorite part of why I liked the book so much.
Yeah.
Is that the layout? You know what it kind of felt like. I listened to it in Audible. I was that was the best way for me to do it. I'm out and about all throughout the day, so the best way for me to do is to listen to it. But when I would come home and I'd sit down on my computer and I would listen to it, it felt like I was in the room with you guys and you were laying out file folders and you said, hey, look, this is the next piece of evidence. This is the next transcript. Here's this one. It was so interesting. It was a researcher style of a layout. But what the nice part about that is it does allow you to come to your own conclusion on it. Absolutely. And I do really, really appreciate that in a story, for sure.
Well, that's it. And we had a different title for it originally. And then I was watching a courtroom drama on TV one night, and they said, we have to prove this beyond reasonable doubt. And that's it. And I emailed Irene, I said, I think I've got a title for our book. She agreed. And what Irina and I, our opinion is, it's only our opinion, is that if we were able to take all of this proof and all these witnesses and everything else into a courtroom, we could prove that something quite extraordinary happened that night. Not that they were abducted by aliens, but something totally bizarre. But, and we left it there. And
Well, I can't think of another case though, Philip, that you could probably do with what you're talking about with. I mean, I don't know. This is the one for me. I mean, I'm sure people have their favorite cases out there, but this is the one I think by far has the best evidence. I really think that tape recording, especially that the police did, is got to be.
But for those that are not aware, Charlie and Calvin on the night in question ended up in the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. They were interviewed separately. We even have the tape recording of Charlie's interview on his own with the sheriff and the deputy. And then they put them in a room together and left them to it. Unbeknown to Charlie and Calvin, in the desk next to them, there's a tape recorder playing. The deputy thought, we'll get them now. You know, they'll be laughing and joking.
It was smart. It was a good play. Yeah,
they came in, they took the tape out. Charlie and Calvin had no idea what was going on. And, of course, they're crawling up the walls on this tape. You know, Calvin's crying and praying. Charlie's saying, you know, son, I thought I'd been through hell on earth until this happened to us. Because he'd fought in Korea, you see, Charlie.
Yep.
He'd been a veteran of the Korean conflict. And that changed the attitude of the sheriff, Sheriff Fred Diamond and his deputy, Glenn Ryder. They then began to believe them, you know.
Right.
And Glenn Ryder said on many occasions when he was interviewed, you know, especially the young guy, which was Calvin. Calvin was only 18 at the time, almost 19, but he was 18. And he said, scared the bejesus out of him. Whatever happened to them, you know. And Calvin was a tough guy. He was a good guy to have around if you wanted to fight, you know.
Yeah, it appears that way. Absolutely, yeah.
He's almost crying, you know. And same with the sheriff. The sheriff said, you know, if these two guys are acting, they ought to be in Hollywood.
Well, the sheriff believed it. I mean, the doctors at the hospital believed him. I mean, there's so many credible witnesses to just talking to them, people that really said that they believed the story. Yeah. But how do you feel? I've always wanted to ask you this. How do you feel the story how the story initially leaked? Do you think it was the police department? Was it the hospital? Was it Keesler Air Force Base? Because all of them had access that night. How do you think it got out?
Well, that's one of the things we've not been able to find out is who leaked the story. Because as they left the sheriff's department that night, the sheriff said, we won't say anything. So they went home. And they got up to go to work next morning. And by the time they got to the shipyard, you know, it had hit the proverbial fan. It really had. And they were summoned to the boss's office. And he said, what the hell have you two been doing? The phones won't stop ringing. I've got newspaper men outside. I can't get any work done. So they told the boss. Calvin and Charlie blamed at the time the sheriff. So the sheriff was there that morning and he said, no, wasn't us. We didn't say anything. So many years later in my conversations with Calvin, we went through this. Who the hell could have leaked it?
Right.
And he said he just wondered if it wasn't some guy who had access to a scanner and listened to the police radio, because they phoned the police.
Yeah.
When they decided to speak up, they were driving home. Initially, weren't going to tell anybody. Charlie had a change of heart, so they stopped at a convenience store, used the payphone, and they first phoned Keesler Air Force Base.
Correct.
And they said, we're not interested. Ring your local agency. So they did. And it was the police who got the call initially, but because of where, you know, this is how it works in America, because of where they were located, it was then patched through to the sheriff's department. And I mean, again, for example, we spoke to the gentleman who took that phone call from Charlie Hickson that night, the police dispatcher. He said, Philip, I must have taken 50 plus calls of UFO sightings that night. And when I got back to the station, there's people there reporting them in person, you know. So Calvin wondered if somebody with a scanner maybe was listening into the police frequency and maybe picked it up that way. That was the only because he couldn't pinpoint anyone else. Charlie didn't do it. He didn't do it. You know, they didn't go to the hospital until the day after. So, but the story was already out by that time. The sheriff didn't do it. The deputy didn't do it. So there was no obvious person that was responsible, but it got out, you know, and that was it. And you mentioned the doctor. You know, the shipyards used a doctor who's called Dr. Boros. And he was there that morning. And we managed to track him down and we interviewed him twice.
Yeah.
You know, he's sadly no longer with us. So thankfully, we got him interviewed while we could. And his interviews, of course, are in the book. And he was a lovely guy, you know, lovely guy. And he also believed that they were telling the truth.
Yep. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, there were a lot of big names attached to this case, too, that I didn't even realize at the time. I mean, J. Allen Hynek, obviously a huge name. I mean, they came down there with Hardin and they did their regression. What do you think happened to that regression transcript?
Well, we have one of them. I have got one of them. Calvin was regressed. Yeah. And I have that on tape. It's recently been uncovered.
Oh, okay. So, because I remember in the book, you said we were wondering where that was at. Okay.
Well, we got it now.
Incredible.
I have a transcript of it. Charlie's regression wasn't taped by Dr. Harder.
Right.
And the reason we know that is because a number of things happened. When the book came out, literally within weeks, a young lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Prince, who runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi, she contacted me. She had an interest in the case. They have a Facebook page. She'd met Calvin, bought his book. She put a couple of things on their Facebook page about him. One of their members stepped forward and said, I have 2 boxes of paperwork that used to belong to Charles Hickson.
Yeah, wow.
Are you interested? So she gave it to Chelsea. Chelsea contacted me. Yeah. And within no time, I had copies of it on a thumb drive.
Awesome, yeah.
So there's no smoking gun in it, but it's a fascinating glimpse back in time, Matthew. Now, we'd searched and searched and searched for, we mentioned Dr. James Harder. He was there, but he was there on behalf of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, one of the biggest UFO groups at the time. So we assumed he'd written a report. Now, the APRO files were held by 2 people in Arizona. They were partners, you know, a man and a woman.
Right.
And they would not let anyone near them. I corresponded with them. They were very pleasant. The lady died a couple of years back. I told the fella that owned them, you know, I'm donating my files to David Marler. David runs the National UFO Historical Record Center in Albuquerque. And they've all been, my stuff's all been donated.
Right.
Out of the blue, at the back end of last year, this gentleman, he's called Brian, he contacted David Marler. And he said, I want to see your layout of your stuff you've got, your archive. So David says, we'll make an appointment. He says, no, I want to see it tomorrow. So this guy drove from Arizona to Albuquerque, saw how David had set out his archive, which is amazing, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, right, do you want the APRO files? What? Yeah. They drew up a legal document. They were donated free of charge. The only thing they had to pay was the transport. This guy who owned them, he even drove the van with all the files in. He wouldn't let anyone else do it. He delivered them. So
it's probably pretty smart, though, you know? You got to hold on to that stuff. I mean, I don't blame him.
Well, no, I'm just telling you the story how it unfolded.
Right.
And I'm thinking, I know David very well, and I'm thinking, great, you know, files. So a couple of weeks went by, and David says, I can't find any paperwork on them, Philip. I've had a look through them. I said, okay, you know, no problem. And then a little while later, he said, I got an email from David, and he said, have you got these audio files, Philip? The answer straight away was no. There was 5 audio tapes. And hey presto, he digitized them and set one of which is Calvin Parker under hypnosis on October the 14th, 1973 with Dr. James Harder.
Incredible.
It doesn't last long. The others, again, there's no smoking guns, but the others give you an idea of what's going on. Because these other tapes were all done in the days thereafter. So you've got Dr. Hynek interviewing the sheriff. You've got Dr. James Harder at a press conference. So you get an idea of what else was going on behind the scenes.
The entire scene itself, the whole flow,
Absolutely.
how this all went down. Yeah, I mean, you can really start to kind of piece together those days after.
What we got as well is Charlie Hickson being interviewed by the Sheriff's Department on that night of October the 11th, 1973. So he's literally, a couple of hours earlier, had this experience, and here we have him on tape. Again, it's not the clearest thing, but I turned it up loud. I was quite prepared to make my ears bleed if necessary, and I've transcribed it,
I don't blame you. Well, I mean, on the topic of regression, I mean, since we're here, there is a lot of debate on whether or not regression is a useful tool in these cases. How do you feel personally about it? I mean, you've heard all these tapes and you hear all the stories. Yeah,
I think there's a good argument for and against, but at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, it all boils down to the individual who undergoes hypnosis and how they see it, whether it was of any use to them, did it set their mind at ease, did it clarify things? I'll give you an example. I asked Calvin this very same question. What do you think to the hypnosis? He says, not a lot, really, because I remembered it all anyway.
Yeah, of course.
So it doesn't really matter what I think, what you think, or anybody else thinks. I'd rather listen to the individual who undergoes it. And if it benefits them and they think, this is of use, then fair enough. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I've always wondered, I wonder if a lot of it comes down to how truthful someone is consciously. If you have someone who's consciously that lies a lot, I wonder if when you get into that subconscious, they stay that way. Or if you have someone that's just more open, more truthful, they're able to get in those states and they're able to get better evidence out of it. What do you think about that?
Well, it could well be, but I remember back in the 1990s again, there was a gentleman who wanted to conduct hypnosis on two different witnesses to two different events, two men. And he hired a professional psychologist to do this, who was trained in hypnosis as well. And I sat on these two sessions purely as an observer. Wasn't allowed to ask any questions or write any note. I mean, nothing.
Right.
One gentleman, we had a period of missing time. And he was really raring to go. He was full of it. He was excited. And when they put him under hypnosis, nothing. He just told the story that he'd told while he was conscious. So nothing changed. The other guy, he was very quiet, a little bit nervous. But when he was put under hypnosis, this big story then came out. So we got, looking at the two characters, we got the opposite of what I expected. I really did,
Right.
But again, I think it's all down to the individual. People will say, well, I don't use any leading questions. Well, it's impossible not to have a leading question. You just cannot do it. Not only that, they know who you are.
Yeah.
You're a UFO researcher. But what we did with the book, one of the other witnesses that stepped forward who had their own encounter is Mr. and Mrs. Blair.
Yes.
Mr. Blair is deceased. Mrs. Blair is still alive, although we spoke to Mr. Blair before he passed away. And she wanted to undergo hypnosis. Not us, we didn't ask her. So eventually we arranged it for her. But what we did with the hypnotherapist, and she was a local hypnotherapist, nothing else, is we didn't tell her anything about what was going on. That we only told her that Mrs. Blair wanted to go back to a date, a time, and a location. And that was it. And I had it filmed as well. So I had it filmed professionally. And one of the interesting things for me, Matthew, is while this is going on, when Mrs. Blair starts talking about the incident, you see the look on the hypnotherapist's face.
Trust me, I believe it. I mean, you should have seen the look on my face listening to it.
Well, there you go. So you know what I'm saying. And it surprised all of us. It really did. And again, we transcribed the hypnosis session. We put it all in the book, every word, so there's nothing redacted. And then, with the same hypnotherapist, we had the chance to put Calvin under hypnosis again. Not that we needed to, but we just had the opportunity, and we were also able to film it.
Okay, yeah.
So we did that, and Calvin was he just told the same story he told us, a dozen times before. So nothing in that respect changed. But now we have it on film as well. And of course, that transcript is in the book.
And I want to make a point too that this is very recent. That was what, 2022?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this is all very, very recent. I mean, this book just came out last year, so this isn't, something like typically when you get a lot of UFO content, a lot of it's old, and you don't really get this kind of an update. And if you do get an update, it's not as meaty as this. I mean, Mrs. Maria Blair's whole account. If all you ever listened to in this book or read about this book is her 2 chapters that go over her, it's already worth the price of admission. It's incredible to understand what's going on.
And not only that, here was another lady with her husband who did not step forward. What happened was, for those that are not aware, Calvin did a little sort of 8-minute mini documentary with a local journalist when his book came out. That eventually ended up on YouTube. And I'm reading the comments underneath it, and there's a couple of thousand of these comments.
And they can be dangerous sometimes. They can be dangerous, the comments.
And I hadn't gone far down it, and there was a message, and it said, to the words to the effect of, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. Now, that caught my attention.
Oh, yeah.
I managed to find this person, turned out to be a young lady, and I explained who I was. I said, could we speak to your mum and dad, please? Will you ask them? And she says, I will. And she come back and said, yeah, it's Mr. and Mrs. Jerry and Maria Blair. Here's the telephone number. So I rang them up. I spoke to Mrs. Blair, explained things. She told me the story in short detail. What she said was her husband worked offshore in the oil rigs. And they were on the opposite side of the river that night, on a pier, parked in the car. There's a little boat to take them out, but his boss was late. And he wasn't in the best of moods. He tried to have a sleep, and she said, saw this thing come down the river, this blue thing. And it hovered over the riverbank opposite, as if it was lost or as if it was looking for something.
Searching. Yeah, that was very interesting to me.
She knew the area, so she knew there was no airfield or anything there.
Right.
So at this point, they decided to walk down this little pier and put Mr. Blair's belongings onto this little boat. His boss still hasn't turned up. And as they're walking down the pier, there's this splash in the water next to them. And this creature pops up out of the water. And she said, it's this grey man.
Yeah.
And back down it goes in the water and under, and didn't come back up. She took the stuff on the boat. She said the time was approximately 9 o'clock. She then headed back, scared. And she said by the time she got back to the car, it was 12 o'clock, midnight.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, we left it at that. She talked on a little local news about seeing these blue lights and this, not much more. Mr. Blair did not want to talk about it at all. And then he took ill, seriously ill. And he said to Maria, I have something to tell you. We too were abducted that night. Now, it's a good job he was ill, because I think she was going to kill him. As ill as he was, as ill as she was as mad as hell,
I would be. I'd be upset. I mean, with the story that he tells her, my goodness.
Then literally, he's in hospital. He's going to have an operation. He wasn't sure he was going to survive. And he insisted that she ring me from the hospital on her mobile. And I spoke to him, and she filmed it as well. And he said, Philip, I think he calls me Mr. Mantle. But he said, Philip, I lied. I saw everything that my wife saw. I saw the creature. He called him the grey humanoid. He survived the operation, but it was only a temporary fix. His days were numbered.
Sure.
So it's almost like a deathbed confession. but it
Right.
lasted, wasn't just overnight.
Well, he lost his voice, right? And that was a big part of it too. That when he finally got the voice back, correct?
Yeah, and because he was on a ventilator, and I mean Maria's questioning him pretty much up until the day he passed away. And we have this little short video clip of him sat in his hospital bed, no shirt on. He's still got electrodes stuck on him because he'd had an ECG. Yeah. I know the operation he was going to have because I had the exact same one. He was having a pacemaker fitted, and I have one. So I knew what he was going through, but sadly he passed away. So again, we have Mrs. Blair's testimony, we have what Mr. Blair said. They did not step forward. They kept this to themselves. Even their two daughters, they told their two daughters they'd seen the UFO, but nothing else. So that's why on that Facebook post, YouTube post, their daughter put, my mum and dad saw the UFO. Nothing about anything else. They did not know. And Mr. Blair said, I didn't want us to be looked as fools. I didn't want people to think we were nutcases. That's why they insisted on keeping it quiet all them years.
And Philip, I have an interesting, I think, take on that. And to be honest, why I think that's credible for him to say that, and why I think a lot of these witnesses that are coming forward are credible in this book. When you look at 1973, what an interesting time. What happened? The Condon Report ended in 68, and Project Blue Book ended in 69. So you had 4 years later after that, you had the most stigma the topic has seen in a very long time, and it was fresh stigma. And I could believe it.
You've got to look at the U.S. as well. You were heavily involved in the Vietnam War.
Incredibly, yeah.
Nixon, Watergate. All that was going on. So I can understand it. And I can understand why some people, the Blairs didn't, but some people have stepped forward. Because they're now of an age, Matthew, and they couldn't give a monkeys what anybody thinks.
Well, I think the 2017 New York Times article too, I think that helped as well, right?
Yeah. Not only that, they saw Calvin now on the local TV news being treated with respect. Same in the newspaper, same in international bits and pieces that he did, So they thought, well, maybe there's time to do it now, Times have changed in that respect. Plus, they've changed. And one or two of them did say to me, I don't give a, I couldn't care less. I nearly swore then. I do apologize.
Right. No, you're fine. But
they say I couldn't care less. I'm 70 plus now, and I just want to tell the story while I still can. And like I said, when you read the book, I think there's 3 people in there that passed away, including Calvin, of course, since we wrote the book. And, Calvin got to see an advance copy of it, and he wrote the foreword for us, even though he was ill. So, we have his seal of approval. And we've, again, no sooner had we published the book, and I think we interviewed 4 or 5 more witnesses that have come forward. We had all the paperwork that belonged to Charles Hickson, and we've got these audio files from David Marler, and on it goes, and it continues.
Eddie Hickson's account in the book is incredible too. And I don't want to give anything away from the account because I want people to be able to read it. But when you look at abductions, the time you spend in this topic, I really want to get your opinion on this. Do you feel that there's a family tree connection to this?
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. But one of the reasons for speaking to Eddie and also interviewing Waynette Parker, Waynette was engaged to Charlie back in 1973, was to show how, this type of experience not only affects those that have had it, but their loved ones as well, and it was a big burden that Calvin carried. And Eddie will tell you, and he does do, and for those that are not aware, if you've got Netflix, there's a new series just come out called Files of the Unexplained. It's an 8-part series. The first episode is the Pascagoula case, and Eddie Hickson is featured in that quite heavily because his father's no longer here. But he talks about how it affected his family. And he said, my mum was absolutely terrified that this was going to happen again. You know, Eddie wasn't, Charlie wasn't that bothered afterwards. So it was his wife that was doing the looking over the shoulder, wondering if it might happen again.
Yeah.
You know, Calvin.
Well, before you go on, Phil, if I can jump in just for a second.
Yeah.
That is an incredible point, is that you hear this resounding feeling that everyone felt like it's going to happen again. Everybody felt that way. Interesting. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it was just, you know, I think it's a natural reaction. If anyone's suffered any kind of trauma,
that's a good point.
They're kind of looking out of the, you know, looking each way and thinking, I mean, some people who are traumatized won't leave the house, for example.
Yeah.
Or some people who've had their house burgled, you know, can't stand to be in the house. You know, they have to have it redecorated or whatever, you know. Like Calvin, that night when they got back to Charlie's, he was staying there. He took all his clothes off, put them in a bag and dumped them in the rubbish. And then he got in the shower and cleansed himself with bleach. Now, you talk to men, usually young women who've been sexually abused, they, you know, have similar feelings. You know, this is trauma.
Yeah.
And Calvin carried that trauma with him for the rest of his life. Charlie, not so much, because Charlie was a lot older. He was 42 at the time. He'd been a veteran in the army in Korea, under fire, and he used his experience in Korea to help him get through this, whereas Calvin didn't have any of those life skills, you know? And
yeah.
I've often said, if anyone can remember the 1980s, there was a popular TV show, The Hulk. And the Hulk would go from town to town. He'd have an adventure in each town, but there was a journalist tracking them. And then they would move on to the next town and the next town to keep out. Calvin did that in real life.
Yeah.
With his wife and family. Once the journalist caught up with him, it was up sticks and gone. There was even one place he lived, he changed his name. And his boss called him in one day and said, "You're fired." He said, "What for?" He said, "Well, your name doesn't match your social security number."
Man.
You know?
I mean,
So
you'll go to a lot of lengths to avoid trauma like that. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, so he literally did it in real life. And he would often say, if he saw Charlie on the television, I wish that goddamn fella had stopped talking about it, you know. Charlie did a couple of things, Calvin did a couple of things, and he would pop up now and again with Calvin, usually at Charlie's request, and then he'd disappear back into the undergrowth, you know. So you have two gentlemen here, different age groups, different life experiences, but they have the same traumatic experience. Both deal with it very, very differently indeed. It wasn't until Calvin wrote his book that he told Waynette, his wife, in full everything that happened.
Yeah.
You know, she said, he clearly didn't want to tell me, so why ask him? You know?
Oh, so she never really pestered him, you think about it?
No. She said right from day one, you know, she got the gist of what had happened, but not in any great detail. And it wasn't until the book was done that, you know, he told her the whole story.
Yeah.
I mean, she knew him.
Yeah.
I got to know him. I became very good friends with him. And there were certain aspects of the encounter he did not like talking about. So there was no point in me asking him questions because he just wouldn't tell me. He would tell me when he was ready.
Yeah.
You know, and he did eventually.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody put their finger down my throat, you know, I'd probably be a little bit weird to talk about that, right? I mean, I always find it interesting in these abduction cases that these beings, whatever they are, they always like to, you know, tell you, hey, we're not here to hurt you, you're okay. But then they kind of do the opposite, right? Like they put you in really uncomfortable positions a lot of the time. What do you think that's all about with that part of the phenomenon?
I don't know, but it's not okay, is it? You're lying there and can't move. You're there against your will. So you may not physically hurt me to any great degree, but this is not on you. You couldn't just walk down the street now and get hold of a person and say, I'm gonna render you, you know, unconscious, lie you out on a table. I'm not going to do anything to you. I'm just going to put you there for a couple of hours and then put you back again. They wouldn't look too kindly on that, would they? You know?
No.
So again, it's not in every account. That crops up now and again.
Right.
And you know, I don't know if it's sometimes your subconscious that's at work, and it's your subconscious trying to tell you how to deal with this. Don't worry about it. Nobody's going to hurt you, you know. And you think it's these creatures that's saying it, but maybe it's not. I don't know. It's just an idea.
Yeah. No, incredible. I think another really big point in the book for me was when you started going, and honestly, I think you undersold it, if I could be fair, a little bit in the book. The USOs.
Yes.
This is, man, you want to talk about linking present day to past.
Yeah.
These USOs is incredibly interesting. You know, what happened with the Ryans, you know, what they've seen. And not only just that, I think that the location of the Pascagoula River comparative to the Gulf of Mexico and how we've had these reports of them coming in and out of these oceans. What do you think about that? The connection to the Gulf of Mexico and Pascagoula?
Well, you know, I don't know. I don't know if there is a connection. You know, it's easy to make connections.
Right.
But for people listening, what they don't know is November the 6th, 1973. So we're talking a couple of weeks later, the same stretch of water where Charlie and Calvin were fishing, but just a little bit further out, there were 3 local fishing boats, 3 skiffs with 8 people aboard, I believe. And they were just, you know, with their nets in, and then they saw this thing under the water. It was circular. They said it was segmented like an old Second World War parachute. It lit up. They got so close to it, they hit it with an oar and it went clunk. And the lights went out and they played cat and mouse with it around this area. They went to the Coast Guard station in person and reported it. The Coast Guard sent a boat out. They too saw it. They too hit it with an oar and it went clunk. And there was a full Coast Guard report about it. And we have all the documents, all unredacted in the book. And this is how things, again, work, Matthew.
Yeah.
Someone said to me, do you know so-and-so's got a photograph of all those civilian witnesses? No. So I emailed so-and-so and he says, yeah, here you go, Philip. What happened the following day, the Navy came out, they interviewed the people, and they just stood them by the quayside and took a colour photograph of them. Then on the back of the photograph is each person and their age. So we knew who everybody was. And we thought, what if any of them's still alive? You know, why not? So, social media, here's this picture. Anybody know any of these people? Within a couple of hours, literally, a lady had contacted me and said, they're all deceased apart from one. And I think he was related to her by marriage. I said, could we speak to him? I'll find out. A couple of days later, we have him on the phone, and that's Mr. Earl Ryan. He was 16 at the time, and he was in the boat with his dad. You know, he saw the thing, and we interviewed him, and the interview is in the book. Now, what was supposed to happen is that the Navy, not the Coast Guard, the Navy, because they sent a fella out, we know his name and his rank and everything, was supposed to do a report. We've even got newspaper cuttings saying, you know, so-and-so from the Navy is going to release this report, but we can't find any report. So whether it ever happened or not, I don't know. You know, We've made inquiries and so far they've drawn a blank. But you're right, Matthew, it is a fascinating aspect of the whole case. There are those that will say, well, it happened 3 weeks later, it's not connected. Oh, come on. You know, it's the same piece of water. You know,
correct.
How can it not be connected? But again, it's in the book. You can decide for yourself whether it's connected or not. Had we not put it in, somebody would have said, well, you're hiding it, you know. So you can't win. So we decided, like I said, right from the beginning, we put everything in. And nobody can accuse us of hiding anything, and they can make up their own mind. But like we say, we now jump forward to today. And everybody's hunting for these things under the sea.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And that's why I wonder, you know, I'd like to even hear more about Keesler, because they're right off Biloxi Bay, which is right there attached to the Gulf as well, not far, a little more to the west.
Yeah, when the first place they phoned was Keesler Air Force Base that night of October the 11th. They said, we're not in the UFO business anymore. So the next day, Charlie and Calvin are taken by the sheriff to the Singing River Hospital, give them a quick once-over, they're fine. Somebody said, what about radiation? The hospital says, we can't check for that. Well, Keesler can. So the sheriff, he phones Keesler Air Force Base.
Right.
You know, by the time they got to Keesler Air Force Base, everybody was waiting for them. So several guys in hazmat suits, Geiger counter, no, you're clear, guys. And then the brass said, well, why are you here? Well, you come and tell us what happened to you. So they did. Now, at Keesler, they didn't have a tape recorder, but what they had there is a stenographer. Like you have in court, you know, there's usually a man or woman punching away on this little funny-shaped thing.
Right.
So we still have a record of every word that was said. And it's a 17-page transcript. It's in the book. Again, all the officers are named. There's nothing redacted. It's all there. And just recently, we've made some more inquiries at Keesler Air Force Base because a gentleman stepped forward who was at Keesler Air Force Base as part of the Air Force at the time. And he said, no, we were sent to X to check on something. And others were sent to Y and Z to check on something. And he mentions the officers' names. It's not, you know, Captain Birdseye or whoever.
Right. Yeah, it's legitimate. Yeah.
So we have names that we can check.
Yeah.
And literally, I think it was just last week or the week before, Keesler Air Force Base came back to us because I'd submitted a Freedom of Information Act request. They've acknowledged it, and that is progressing as we speak. Because now we've got names, you know.
Right.
I'm going to say, well, did this officer send them to check on this? That's all we're looking for is confirmation, you know.
So you're continuing this. This isn't done. I mean, are you thinking about doing yet again another book, maybe a sequel?
There's actually going to be 2 more books in the pipeline, and 2 more documentaries as well. One book will be out later this year, and when I looked at the previous books we'd published on this, we had the hypnosis published across 5 different books.
Right.
So what I've done, I've put all the hypnosis in one book. So it's every transcript. Literally, we're working on it now. What we're trying to do is also provide an audio book that uses as much of the original audio recordings as possible.
That's very cool.
So rather than read the transcript, you'll be able to listen to the hypnosis directly.
Oh, wow.
So you'll have the one from 1973. I don't think is good enough quality. So but we have 2 hypnosis sessions with Bud Hopkins and Charlie Hickson. We have one with Calvin and Bud Hopkins. We have one with Dr. Leo Sprinkle and James Harder with Charlie and Calvin that nobody's ever heard before.
Wow.
So I've literally one of the files I'd had the cassettes digitized. One of the files has become corrupted, so I'm actually sending the original cassette back to a friend to be redigitized because I don't have the equipment to do it. So there will be parts of the audio book that will have to be narrated because, you know, but we're trying to use, so we could end up with 5 or 6 full audio files on the audio book. So you'll be able to hear the hypnosis of Maria Blair, of Charlie, Calvin, etc., etc. So you'll hear it, you know, unedited. Apart from maybe the intro where they're putting them on the hypnosis, you know, that might be the only bit, and the outro, you know, waking up 5, you know, coming around 4, etc.
Yeah.
So, and then, as I mentioned earlier, there were all this other stuff that we've obtained from one place or another, like the recent other audio files from the APRO files that were donated to David Marler. One of the other files that came in, again, I mentioned this one, another audio file came in. It was a big reel-to-reel tape, and it was sent to David Marler, and it's got all sorts on it. So in the box, It's in its original box. You've got this big reel-to-reel tape with handwritten notes of what's on it. And of course, on it is Charlie and Calvin. And I didn't know this. Charlie and Calvin were subjected to another test. We know Charlie had a polygraph, you know. So, during lockdown, I contacted the company that did the polygraph. It was still going.
Oh.
The original polygraph test that was done in 1973, the company was still going. And I tracked them down, and I have correspondence from them. So that's never been published. So I have that. You have this little piece on this other audio tape, and it's a voice stress analysis. And I thought, what the hell is that? So I looked it up online, and I found an article in a magazine where Charlie Hickson had undergone voice stress analysis, and he passed it. It's probably not scientific. It probably would not stand up in a court of law, but it's another interesting aspect of the story. And in fact, I found out they'd done it on him 3 times. And guess what? He passed every time, you know. It's like a polygraph. If you pass it, they say, well, it's rubbish. If you fail it, you're a liar, you know.
Well, if the police secretly record you, that's a pretty good polygraph for me. Yeah. I don't know. That was about enough for me. I needed for it, but
so we have all this other stuff, you know.
Right.
For example, one of the criticisms of the case, and it's a fair criticism, you can see in the background, Calvin even mentions it, there is the bridge that goes over the river. And in those days, it was actually a drawbridge. And you had tenders who opened it manually. Right. And their bridge tender was on duty that night, and he never saw anything. And it was in the newspaper. And the newspaper is quoting him saying, pigging liars, you know, these 2 guys, these 2 hicks, you know. But then a UFO researcher in the States actually tracked this bridge tender down and interviewed him. And he wasn't so dismissive of Charlie and Calvin. He wasn't so critical. And he even says, you know, you might do one operation. He still said he didn't see anything, but he was actually doing something else at that time. He was cleaning something, you know. Okay. So he wasn't even looking at a river.
Yeah.
You know, but again, nobody had published that. So that's going to go in the next book. That'll probably be finished for next year, you know. And there's all these other little loose ends that have cropped up. So I've been trying to tie all those together. So
You've been busy. Yeah. Boy, oh boy. Hey, I respect it. It's incredible to be able to put that much effort and time, and because that stuff doesn't just fall on your feet. It doesn't.
No. I mean, you know, my colleague Irina, she just interviewed another potential witness, although her sighting was 4 to 6 weeks later, but it's in the same area, you know. But we've interviewed it, and we have it on record for whatever. It's there.
Yeah. I think that's what people are going to really be most blown away by. I mean, there's so many reports, even before the event, where people were seeing things and reporting craft in the sky, and after. It's incredible how much activity was around that case. And and like you're saying, it's still coming out.
Well, even the Sheriff Fred Diamond, had his own sighting 2 days later. You know, and we found that in a newspaper article. You won't see Sheriff talking about it anywhere apart from in this newspaper where he was interviewed, you know.
Right.
And their office that week received a couple of thousand calls. I mean, this case went around the globe. You know, I've got newspaper cuttings and magazines in I don't know how many different languages. Just going aside from it, rather than from, you know, the UFO side, one of the most popular rock bands that we all will have known of is Fleetwood Mac. Everybody's heard of Fleetwood Mac.
Of course.
In 1976, they released a song called Hypnotized, and it is partially based on Charlie and Calvin's encounter.
Wow. Interesting.
In that same year, 1976, Italian television company called RAI, R-A-I, made a 2-part TV drama on the Pascagoula case. It's called Extra, and you can watch it on YouTube if you can speak Italian. I have a copy of it on DVD. Charlie and Calvin were oblivious.
Okay.
totally oblivious. They knew nothing about this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, let me ask you something I think is interesting. I mean, I mentioned earlier that Blue Book closed down right there before this event a few years. How do you think that Blue Book would have dealt with this case if it were to happen during that that point in time?
Good question. But we have to remember the guy who was the scientific advisor to Blue Book was Hynek.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, he was there, but I mean, I understand that, but the process still probably would have been still quite different, no?
Don't know. By this time, 1973, Hynek was no longer the critic that he'd been. And what is interesting is that year, 1973, is when Hynek set up the Center for UFO Studies.
Yeah.
You know? So I don't know is the answer. It would be nice to think that Hynek would have still been their scientific advisor and would have dealt with it in exactly the same way he did. You know, he left Pascagoula after hosting a press conference and saying these two guys are genuine and should be treated with respect. They have had an experience, period. He didn't know what it was. And down the years, he didn't change his opinion. And Calvin even became very good friends with his son, Paul Hynek, because Calvin and Charlie both had Dr. Hynek's home telephone number. So when Calvin would call him, it was usually his son, Paul, that would answer the phone. And they didn't have a notepad. He even told me that they used to have a chalkboard next to the phone and he would write the messages on there. And sometimes Paul Hynek would say, my father's not in. And Calvin would say, I know he is, go and get him. I've got Paul and Calvin on video, chatting together. So they became good friends. What I would have liked to have known, and I don't think we'll ever find out, Matthew, is it's only a couple of years later that Hynek then becomes the advisor to the Spielberg film Close Encounters, which features an abduction case. Yeah. And I wonder, because it supposedly was Hynek's favorite case.
I believe it.
I wonder if at any point did Dr. Hynek tell Steven Spielberg about this encounter? I'd love to find out, Is anybody out there, that knows Steven Spielberg, please give him a ring and ask him,
Maybe I'll try to get a hold of him. It's going to be difficult for me, though,
But, I just find that an interesting question because I remember Paul Hynek at one point himself worked in the film business. And he was on set somewhere at these big studios. And Spielberg was elsewhere in the building working on something else. And one night, one of Spielberg's men came down and said, Mr. Spielberg would like to see you in the morning. So Paul thought, great, he's thinking, and he goes and turns up on time and he said, all he wanted to talk about was my father.
I believe it.
So it would be interesting if we could ever get a message through to Spielberg or a letter or whatever to see. Just curious, that's all. Just curious. But it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. No, I mean, Spielberg, Close Encounters is incredible. Incredible. I mean, it's right up there in the top UFO films ever, right? It's hard to really beat that one, right?
Yeah. And of course, there is an abduction sequence in it where the little boy gets taken and, obviously they get him back. They've obviously abducted all the other people as well that come off it, So he wasn't a one-off, but it would be amazing to find out if there was any discussion between the two.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind speculating with me, though, do you think that the craft that came down that everyone's seen with the blue lights that night in 73, do you feel that was ET from somewhere else, or do you feel that it could have been a crypto-terrestrial, something maybe that's in the oceans that was there, that's been here for a really long time? What do you really feel?
It's difficult to pin it down, Matthew, because, I discussed this at length with Calvin.
Yeah.
And he said, he said, I call it aliens now, Philip, because I don't know what the hell else to call it. He thought at one point it might have been some kind of demonic thing. He didn't.
That's
really
popular
believe,
right now, Philip. That's a popular take right now in ufology.
I don't think he really believed it, but Calvin was a Christian and he believed in God and the Bible, and these things or doing bad things to him. So it had to be somebody bad that was doing things. There's other theories that it was the Russians, which is, just madness.
Yeah.
Another theory is that it was some kind of intelligence agency trial using nerve gas. I'm thinking, well, how the hell did they know Charlie and Calvin were going to be there that night? Because they didn't. They only decided on the way home from work, and you spray them with this hallucinogenic nerve gas, and they both have the same experience. What are the odds on that?
Yeah.
Bearing in mind there is Highway 90 bridge with all the traffic going over it. What if some of this hallucinogenic gas wafts over the highway, and there's boats coming and going? So we know that the US military have carried out, experiments on their GIs and other members of the population in the past. But I don't believe they did it in Pascagoula that night in 1973. So that was another thing to look at. And I said to Calvin, why can you not describe the thing that came down in any more detail? He says, because it just blinded you.
I believe it, yeah.
He says, we had to, he says, as it came down, it was bright. He said, and then this door opened and the light from that was even brighter. And he said, you had to put your hand up over it. And he says, that's why, he says, I think there are some discrepancies when we try to estimate how big this thing was. He said, because it was so difficult to look at. He said,
yeah, even inside, right, Philip? I mean, it's hard I always wondered, because they were both not in the same room. They weren't in the same area. They didn't see each other at that point. How big was the craft? I mean, did he ever elaborate on it?
No, Calvin went to the left, Charlie to the right. And Calvin said it in the exact words. He says that the light came out of the paint. In other words, the light just came out of the walls. There was no light fittings, no nothing. And Calvin believed he was, and this is an interesting thing, Calvin believes he was laid on I'll call it a bed, table, but it was translucent. And it was laid at an angle, but he couldn't feel it underneath him.
Wow.
Charlie Hickson said he was suspended. So he was just... Now, several years back, I used to have trouble sleeping. And I'd gone through all the things you can buy in your local pharmacy, and it did no work, no use at all. So I went for hypnotherapy.
Right.
And on my fourth session with the hypnotherapist, again a professional, I'm sat in a huge big leather chair, and you can alter this chair, the settings on it. It's all electric, so it fits you perfectly.
Yeah.
The guy puts me under hypnosis, Matthew, and I'll tell you now, I could not feel that chair underneath me.
Ah, that's interesting.
It is the most comfortable I have ever been in my life. And when Calvin told me that about being laid on this table, he said it's translucent, but he could not feel it underneath him. And I felt that's just how I felt when I was under hypnosis. And whether it's connected or not, I don't know, but it hit me as soon as he said it, So he said, when this thing came out of the ceiling and went around him, he said, it didn't have any wires on it or strings or, it just came down, went around him and went back up again, I don't know, what I would love to have been able to do and say, Calvin, you were definitely, this definitely happened to you. And you just have to accept that. And that's whatever that was. But I couldn't do that. But Calvin did feel vindicated when these other people started coming forward and said, well, hang on a minute, I was driving over the bridge that night and I saw that damn thing. Or like Maria and Jerry Blair, we were on the opposite side of the river that night. This happened to us as well.
Yeah.
Calvin was like, well, I told you so, to tell you. It would have been nice if Charlie had still been around to see all this, but unfortunately not. However, the city of Pascagoula, one of the charities there is called Main Street Pascagoula, raised enough funds. So this wasn't taxpayers' money. There was all raised funds to put in place a historical marker which is close to where the incident happened. That's there for anyone to see. And it's in the name of Charlie and Calvin, not just Calvin. And that was officially unveiled in, I think it was 2018, 2019, by the mayor. And Calvin was in tears, standing next to it, absolutely in tears. But it's there, so, it's there for all to see.
Well, the hockey coach for the Miracle on Ice team, Herb, if you remember him when the U.S. beat the Russians, they said that at the end of the movie that they released about him, he died before the movie came out, just before it. And at the end of the movie, it said, he didn't get to see it, but he lived it. That was Charlie. He didn't get to probably see a lot of this, but he lived it.
Absolutely. And, people said, oh, Charlie was in it for the money. I mean, Charlie would, if you ring Charlie up and say, come and speak at our church on Sunday, he would be there and he'd spend his own money on gas to get there and talk, So, he never made any money out of it whatsoever. Charlie believed that something was going to happen, that these were aliens and something big was going to happen that would be beneficial for all mankind. And he was hoping to play his part in it, So he kept it in the public eye. He believed it was serious enough for people to know about this, And he's not alone in that. I've spoken to other abductees who feel pretty much the same. But so Charlie kept it alive, and I don't blame him. Charlie even made a record, believe it or not. You can hear his account on a 45 record, vinyl. I have a copy. I've got one here in my file. But he just tells the story. Another way of him keeping the story alive. And Calvin, once he decided to tell his story, he did his damnedest as well.
Yeah. Well, I ask everybody this that I can. We talked about all the lights, the blue lights that were on the craft, and there's other reports in the book where there's a lot of colors. There are multicolors that come onto the craft. Why do you think that there's lights on these crafts? What's your theory behind that? Some people think it's because they want to be seen. I always want to get everyone's opinion on this that I can.
That's a great question. I was asked this some years ago. Why do UFOs have lights on them? What a great question. Who knows? It could be something to do with propulsion. We mentioned the film Close Encounters. They communicated using lights rather than a verbal language. Could it be something similar to that? If you think about it, let's assume we're dealing with an extraterrestrial species. By that very nature, they've traversed across space and time somehow. So they are very much more advanced than we are technologically. And can we understand what's going on in front of our eyes? Put it the other way, Matthew. The next most intelligent species on Earth is a dolphin.
Right.
Now we can teach a dolphin to jump up and catch a fish,
Yeah.
But has he got any perception of what the hell we are and what we're doing?
It's true.
We can't ask Flipper if he's feeling okay today, and how's the wife? How's the mini flippers getting on?
Yeah, I mean, we can't expect them to have similar intention either. There's just no way to do that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the books I published is by a Romanian scientist called Dr. Dan Farkas, and he calls it hyper-civilizations. And he's saying his idea is that we are being visited, but these beings are so far in advance of us that we are just too dumb on an intergalactic scale to recognize what's right in front of us. And he gave the analogy. He said, if you found an ant colony and put a flat screen television in the middle of it, they'd crawl all over it. They'd know it was there. The soldier ants might even attack it. But he said, never in a zillion years will they figure out what it is, what it does, and where it comes from, And he said, we could be the intergalactic ants. The answer is staring us in the face. We're just too dumb.
Yeah, I always wonder. I mean, I typically think that we've recovered craft from some form, whether we dug them up, whether they crashed, what have you. But I still wonder every once in a while, did we ever really figure it out, though? Did we ever really get in, and did we truly get behind the wheel and understand it? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, have we ever really figured it out? Is it possible that we didn't?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm biased. I admit this, and I think the Pascagoula case and the evidence that we've uncovered tops just about any other case. Because most of the people that we've interviewed are still alive, So you can go and ask them the same questions we have. You know, I know there are others out there that were also witnesses that haven't gone on the record. So there's more people to be interviewed. And so you don't have to wait for disclosure. You know, disclosure's coming. No, it's not. You know,
not from the government. I agree with you on that. That's for sure.
It's not coming. So, you know, please don't hold your breath. And if anybody tells you it is, they're lying. You know, so you've got cases like this and others that the information is there. All we need to do is have somebody much more intelligent than me study it and try and make sense out of it, you know?
Right.
Rather than wait for the next army or military pilot to see something. The evidence is there. We just need to make sense of it.
Yeah. Well, look, I could talk to you for another 2 hours, Philip, but I mean, you know, it's Sunday and I know your wife probably is getting after you or something. You got something going on and I know mine is. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share? Anything about this case? Maybe something you haven't even talked about before and you've been waiting for an opportunity to mention it?
Well, what I will say is that we've been speaking with Mrs. Blair even more. You know, she was unavailable at times because of her husband's problems and he died and she had to move residence and things like that. So at the back end of last year, I got Maria on camera for the first time. We've got her hypnosis on camera, but this is Maria sat in a chair with a young lady interviewing her, and I've sent the questions, and she made it very clear. And I actually went back to her afterwards to clarify this. Not only did her and her husband have their own encounter that night, but she saw what happened to Calvin and Charlie. Not just a blue light. She saw this thing come down and saw what happened. And I have it on video. Wow. You know, I have it on audio. And so I went back, because she doesn't say it all in one go. She mentions it bit by bit throughout the interview.
Yep.
So when the interview was finished, I went back to Maria and I said, I just want to clarify this, Maria. Are you saying you saw Charlie and Calvin being abducted that night? She said, yes.
Wow.
So I'll leave that there. And that will be released in due course. You know, it's not being hidden for any ulterior motive.
Right.
You know, it will be made available at some point. And make of it what you will. Like everything else we've managed to bring to the table, Matthew, make of it what you will.
Yeah. And I can't stress enough how I love that attitude on it. You know, that tells me that you really want to get to the truth of it, and that's it. You know, we got to see where the evidence takes us, and we want to let people make up their own mind. You know, we got to believe in people more, Philip. You know, that they have some intelligence too. They can come to a conclusion. They can look at something and understand what's going on.
Who am I to tell anybody anything? I'm just
I agree.
I'm just your average guy. You know, I've got no doctorate. I've got no, you know. Right. No high school qualifications and nothing, you know. Yeah. We're working with a retired academic like Dr. Scott. We've published everything we've got, and what else we're accumulating now will also be published. And you decide for yourself, you know. Yeah. There's a lot of people out there a lot smarter than I am. I'm who the hell am I to tell them anything, you know.
But you've done great work though, Philip. You've done great work, and you know you don't have to have a PhD to do great work, and you've done great work.
Not at all, mate. Not at all. That's the way I look at it. I think part of your job, if you want to call it that, as a UFO investigator, is to document things as best you can, and in the hope that somebody somewhere will be able to make sense of it. You know. Or not, as the case may be. You know?
Well, yeah, because no one really has the answer. That's why I'm here. That's why you're still here. You know, we're all trying to figure out this thing and understand.
If you think about various other branches of science, you know, people were making observations and just you know, logging it, writing it down until somebody eventually caught up with it and then made sense of it. I have to give the example rocks from the sky. It's not that long ago that the science of the day said rocks cannot fall from the sky. Have a look in the sky. There are no rocks. Right. But I think it was in the mid-19th century, over France, there was a shower of meteorites, and they finally had to admit that rocks did fall from the sky. Now we have to figure out how the hell they've got here and where the hell did they come from.
And if there's a big enough one that's going to take us out before we want to, you know what I mean?
So as far as UFOs are concerned, we now can admit that rocks fall from the sky. The UFO phenomenon is real. You know,
something's going on, no doubt about it.
Something's going on. Now we just need to make sense of it.
Correct. So the book is Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. Philip, this has been incredible. All the links, guys, will be in the description. There's an audio version of the book. There's also, obviously, a regular version of the book, which, you know, before we go, I got to say, is there a way to get a hold of, there's some photos, I think, that were included in the book that I missed out on. Is there a way that if somebody has to do an audio version of it, that they can see those photos somewhere?
No, basically.
Okay.
I haven't figured that technology out. I can only just do a text, never mind anything else, Matthew.
Right.
Come on. But no,
I mean, that's okay. You know, I'm just looking for the bonus features. You know, I want to see the extra as much as I can. So I'll end up getting the book then, either way.
You can get the Kindle. The Kindle, you can download the Kindle. That is exactly the same as the book. There's no different. All the images in with that.
Oh, okay. So I went through Audible, so Kindle's the way to go then.
Yeah, and what we've done with the book as well, we've made it available in various different formats and sizes because we understand the economic problems that we have today. So you can buy it in a 6x9 paperback. You can buy it in a 10x8 paperback. You can buy it in a huge hardback. That's the most expensive. But then you've got the Kindle, which is the cheapest, and then the audiobook. The reason I started doing audiobooks is because a gentleman contacted me and said, Philip, any chance of an audiobook? I'm a long-distance truck driver.
Yeah.
And I listen to them while I'm driving.
Right.
So, you know, we've tried to do all the books in audio format as well. So
it's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah. So I'm still learning, you know, with the publishing side of things.
You're doing good. You're doing better than I would out of the gate. You're doing better than I would with it. So yeah, I mean,
hopefully there's something there for everybody's pocket if they want to buy a copy. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, so go down to the links, you know, check out the book. Trust me, it's incredible. There's going to be many moments in the book where you'll go, wow, really? There are. I mean, I had them, so I can just tell you with personal experience. But thank you again, Philip. You've really made my Sunday, and I appreciate your work. And we look forward to seeing more from you in the future, all right?
Well, absolutely, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.